In the rugged, untamed wilderness of the Santa Lucia Range in California, a legend has been passed down through generations. The early Spanish settlers called them Los Vigilantes Oscuros, or the Dark Watchers. These mysterious, silhouette-like entities are said to observe travelers from a distance, never approaching but always watching. It was a story that many dismissed as mere folklore, a tale to scare children. But for those who had seen them, the fear was all too real. In the summer of 1992, a group of friends set out to explore the Santa Lucia Range. Their names were Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Mike, and they were all students at a nearby university, eager for adventure before the school year resumed. They had heard whispers of the Dark Watchers but laughed them off as mere superstition. The group was well prepared for their trek. They had maps, compasses, and enough supplies to last a week. Their plan was to hike deep into the mountains, camp under the stars, and return with stories of their own to tell. As they set off from the trailhead, the sun was shining, and the sky was a brilliant blue. Spirits were high, and the air was filled with laughter and banter. On the first day, they made good progress, covering several miles and setting up camp in a picturesque clearing by a stream. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, toasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Inevitably, the conversation turned to the legend of the Dark Watchers. "Have any of you actually seen them?" Emily asked, her tone skeptical. Jake shook his head. "Nope, but my grandfather swears he saw one when he was a kid. Said it just stood there, watching him from the ridge." Sarah shivered. "That's creepy. But come on, it's just a story. Right, Mike?" Mike, who had been unusually quiet, stared into the fire. "I don't know. My uncle used to work as a forest ranger around here. He told me once that there are things in these mountains that can't be explained." The group fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound. The laughter and lightheartedness of the day seemed to fade with the setting sun, replaced by an uneasy feeling that none of them could shake. The next morning, they continued their hike, pushing deeper into the mountains. The landscape grew wilder and more remote, with towering cliffs and dense forests that seemed to close in around them. By late afternoon, they reached a high ridge with a panoramic view of the valley below. "This is amazing," Sarah said, snapping pictures with her camera. "We should camp here tonight." They set up their tents and prepared dinner, enjoying the breathtaking sunset. As the last light of day faded, Emily wandered a short distance from the camp to take in the view. She stood on the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley, when she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if she were being watched. Turning slowly, she saw them. Dark, human-like figures standing on the ridge opposite hers, barely visible against the twilight sky. There were 3 of them, motionless, silent, and watching. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, never taking her eyes off them. "Guys," she called out, her voice trembling. "Come here, quick." The others hurried over, their faces registering confusion and then fear as they saw the figures on the distant ridge. "What the hell are those?" Jake whispered. "The Dark Watchers," Mike said, his voice grim. "We need to leave. Now." "But it's almost dark," Sarah protested. "We can't hike out of here in the dark." "We don't have a choice," Mike insisted. "We need to go. Pack up, quickly." They scrambled to gather their belongings, their movements frantic and disorganized. By the time they were ready to leave, the sun had set, and darkness had enveloped the mountains. They turned on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the inky blackness as they made their way down the trail. As they hiked, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figures following them. The forest seemed alive with whispers and rustling leaves, the air thick with an oppressive silence. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow canyon. The trail wound through it, the walls towering above them. It was a natural bottleneck, and they moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the rock. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping suddenly. They all paused, listening. There was a faint sound, like the distant murmur of voices, but too indistinct to make out any words. "Keep moving," Mike urged. "We need to get out of here." They hurried on, their nerves frayed and their senses on high alert. The trail grew steeper, and they had to climb over boulders and navigate treacherous footing. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls of the canyon were whispering to them. Suddenly, Emily screamed. She had tripped over something, a large, flat stone covered in strange carvings. She shone her flashlight on it, revealing a series of symbols that none of them recognized. "What is this?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Mike replied. "But I don't like it. Let's keep moving." They climbed out of the canyon and emerged onto another ridge. The moon had risen, casting an eerie light over the landscape. The valley below was shrouded in darkness, and the distant mountains loomed like silent sentinels. "There." Sarah pointed. "On the ridge." They saw them again, more dark watchers, standing in a line along the ridge opposite them. There were more this time, at least a dozen, their dark forms stark against the moonlit sky. "Run!" Mike shouted. They bolted down the trail, their panic driving them forward. The dark watchers seemed to multiply, appearing on every ridge and peak, always watching, never moving. The friends ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. "We can't keep this up," Jake gasped. "We need to hide or something." "No," Mike said, shaking his head. "We need to keep moving. We can't let them catch us." As they struggled to their feet, Emily noticed something strange. The ground in the clearing was covered in a fine, black dust. She knelt down and touched it, feeling an icy chill spread through her fingers. "This isn't normal," she said, showing the others. "Something's very wrong here." "Let's just get out of here," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I don't care where we go, we just need to go." They continued down the trail, their progress slower now as exhaustion set in. The dark watchers were everywhere, their presence oppressive and suffocating. The friends stumbled on, driven by a primal fear they couldn't fully understand. Hours passed, and the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. Just as they began to despair, they saw a faint light ahead. It was a small cabin, nestled in a grove of trees. Relief washed over them as they hurried towards it. They reached the cabin and pounded on the door. An old man answered, his face withered and lined with age. "Please," Mike begged. "We need help. There are things out there, watching us." The old man's eyes widened in recognition. "The Dark Watchers," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." "We didn't know," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "We just wanted to hike." The old man nodded and stepped aside, allowing them in. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the horrors outside. "Stay here," the old man said. "I'll do what I can to keep them at bay." He lit a fire in the small wood stove and muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like a prayer or a spell. The friends huddled together, their fear slowly giving way to exhaustion. Just as they began to drift off, there was a loud bang on the door. The old man froze, his face going pale. "They found us," he whispered. The banging grew louder, more insistent. The old man grabbed a shotgun from the corner and aimed it at the door. "Stay back," he shouted. "You have no power here." The door burst open, and the Dark Watchers flooded in. The old man fired, but the bullets passed through them as if they were made of smoke. The friends screamed and tried to run, but the Dark Watchers closed in, their forms shifting and writhing. Emily felt a cold hand close around her wrist, and she was pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the old man's terrified face as the cabin dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadow. When Emily awoke, she was alone in the forest. The sky was a sickly gray, and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. She called out for her friends, but there was no answer. She wandered through the trees, her mind a fog of confusion and fear. Eventually, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a large stone covered in strange carvings, the same stone she had tripped over in the canyon. She felt a strange compulsion to touch it, and as her fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of electricity shot through her body. The world around her shifted and blurred, and she found herself standing on a high ridge, looking out over the valley. The Dark Watchers were there, standing in a line along the ridge, their eyes fixed on her. "You are one of us now," a voice whispered in her mind. "Forever watching, never seen." Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt her body dissolve into shadow, merging with the others. She was no longer Emily, no longer human. She was a Dark Watcher, bound to the mountains, cursed to watch and wait for eternity. The legend of the Dark Watchers continued, their presence a silent sentinel in the rugged wilderness. Travelers spoke of strange figures on the ridges, always watching, never approaching. The friends who had ventured into the Santa Lucia Range were never seen again, their fate a mystery that would remain unsolved. And the mountains kept their secrets, the Dark Watchers ever vigilant, ever waiting for the next curious soul to venture too far into their domain.